Welcome to this explainer. We are diving straight into a massive, almost completely invisible shift happening right now in schools and universities all over the world. It is a shift that doesn't really make headline news, but honestly, it profoundly impacts the survival of our society as we know it. Today, we're unpacking exactly what happens when our education systems decide to prioritize short-term economic growth over the development of human empathy and critical thought. So let's kick things off with a pretty heavy question, one that gets right to the core of what our modern educational systems are actually producing. Are we creating complete citizens, or are we just building useful machines? I know, it sounds a bit dramatic, but as we look at the source material today, you are going to see exactly why leading thinkers are raising red flags. We are fundamentally rewiring the whole purpose of going to school, moving away from cultivating minds and towards simply assembling a compliant workforce. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum warns about this in incredibly stark terms. She actually calls it a silent crisis. All across the globe, funding for the arts and humanities is being aggressively slashed in favor of highly applied technical skills. And because this isn't some sudden outbreak of violence, it goes largely unnoticed. But nations thirsty for short-term profit are heedlessly discarding the exact skills we literally need to keep our democracies alive. And that brings us to the core text we are exploring today. Nussbaum's foundational book, Not-for-Profit: Why Democracy Needs the Humanities. It totally exposes how this relentless pursuit of economic advancement is driving policymakers to view humanistic disciplines as useless trinkets, just extra fluff. But Nussbaum argues that cutting these programs threatens the very foundation of democratic self-government. Without them, we lose the capacity to question, to empathize, and ultimately, to govern ourselves. The argument maps out beautifully, taking us from identifying this silent crisis to contrasting profit versus democracy, and finally examining the real, practical tools needed to educate citizens. It is a clear breakdown of exactly what we stand to lose if we keep treating education purely as a factory for economic output. Section 1. Profit versus Democracy. The clash of two educational paradigms. Okay, so there is a deep, fundamental divide between the two competing goals of education today. On one hand, you have education for profit, which basically redesigns students as future wage earners. It views a student's value entirely through the lens of their future economic output. On the other hand, education for democracy is based on a human development paradigm. It focuses on cultivating reflective, complete citizens who are actually equipped to criticize tradition, treat others as equals, and debate the complex political issues of our daily lives. Now, what's truly fascinating here is why the humanities are actually viewed as a threat by the proponents of pure economic growth. Educators, driving for profit, don't just ignore the arts, they kind of fear them. Why? Because cultivated sympathy is a dangerous enemy of ignorance. Think about it. If you want to push economic development programs that ignore massive inequality, you need moral ignorance. The humanities teach us to see others as complex human beings, which makes it nearly impossible to dehumanize and manipulate them. Once people learn to empathize, they start demanding justice. And well, that can be highly inconvenient for a system solely focused on maximizing the bottom line. Section 2. Socratic Argument and Empathy. The ingredients of a complete citizen. The first essential ingredient we need is Socratic pedagogy. That's just a fancy term for the social practice of critical thinking and independent reasoning. It's about having the guts to argue in a way that challenges tradition and peer pressure. It's not about memorizing facts, it is about active, rigorous debate. Students learn to question their own biases. Without this habit of self-examination, our sources note that people lack clarity about their own goals. They become easily influenced, prone to groupthink, and they defer way too readily to authority figures who might not have their best interests at heart. To really hammer this home, we can look to the pioneering Indian educator Rabindranath Tagore. He said that our minds do not gain true freedom merely by acquiring knowledge or holding on to other people's ideas, but by forming our own standards of judgment. Tagore's philosophy actually helped create prosperous, free-thinking citizens in India's democracy. Yet, crazily enough, our sources note that in recent years, his doctrines have been increasingly scorned and replaced by new, profit-driven concepts. But critical thinking alone isn't enough. We absolutely need what is called narrative imagination. This is the ability to sympathetically imagine what it might be like to be someone else. We're not talking about aggregate data or statistics here. We're talking about understanding the complex story of a human life, the family, the struggles, the illnesses. This cultivated sympathy is literally the only way we can bridge the deep divides in our societies. It lets us step out of our own bubble and genuinely look at our fellow citizens as equals. Section 3. Citizens of the World. Confronting a complex global order. A critical reality we have to confront is that the biggest issues we face today, whether they're economic, environmental, or political, are entirely global in scope. We have absolutely zero hope of solving them unless we can transcend our local loyalties. Education has to equip us to act as global citizens with a solid grasp of world history and global justice. When a supply chain crisis on one side of the planet impacts the food supply on the other, or when environmental disasters cross borders, we absolutely must understand both our cultural differences and our shared human needs to survive. And facts and logic alone, they just aren't going to cut it when trying to relate to a highly complex global order. We need the arts. The arts generate a dialogue with the past, cultivating minds that are open and creative. Because the truth is, you cannot cherish in others what you haven't explored within yourself. And literature provides exactly that kind of profound internal exploration. Section 4. The Democracy Equation. Synthesizing Science and the Humanities. Our sources provide this really cool equation to visualize the balance we've been talking about. Step 1. Empirical sciences plus humanistic studies equals a well-informed citizen. Step 2. Multiply those well-informed citizens together, and boom, you get a successful democracy. This brilliantly shows that science and economics are not the enemies of the humanities. In fact, science pursued with critical thinking is a vital friend of the humanities. It is only the exclusive focus on technical education, at the total expense of the arts, that breaks this equation. We need both halves to make the math work. Yet, we face another layer to this silent crisis today. Researchers examining the liberal arts in our digital age point to the crisis of the unread. In our modern era of algorithms and digital amnesia, the peaceful, sustained acts of reading and writing are declining fast. To read is to listen across time. To write is world-making. The philosopher Hannah Arendt famously warned that a separation from language, a kind of thoughtlessness, often creates the way to devastation. When we lose the habit of deep reading and writing, our public discourse basically atrophies into pure cacophony, and healthy debate just devolves into force. So I will leave you with this final provocative thought to chew on. If we cease to read and write our own histories, whose narrative are we actually living in? Prioritizing profit over complete empathetic citizens is an incredibly dangerous gamble. The survival of our democratic institutions doesn't just depend on the technology we build, it depends on the humanity we cultivate. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep asking the big questions.